Good afternoon, welcome everyone to this webinar on ransomware. My name is Simon Newman. I'm the head of cyber and business services for an organisation called Police Crime Prevention Initiatives. And within that, look after the Police Digital Security Centre, the National Business Crime Centre, and currently in the process of building the new Cyber Resilience Centre for London as well. Delighted to be joined today by some very esteemed colleagues and speakers who have a considerable amount of knowledge and experience in this field. First of all, I'd like to introduce Jason Kotler. Jason is joining us all the way from Toronto in Canada. So it's just gone past 8 o'clock in the morning over in Canada. So a very big welcome to Jason. Jason is the founder and president of an organization called Cypher. They are experts in ransomware recovery, ransomware facilitation of payments, and also in incident response as well. So welcome, Jason, and good to have you on board.
Thank you.
Also like to introduce Stuart Room. Stuart is a very well-known and highly regarded legal expert on data protection, privacy, and cybersecurity, working for the global law firm DWF. Welcome, Stuart. Good to have you on board today as well. Also like to introduce Adele Gruber. Adele is Senior Global Cyber Privacy and Technology Underwriter at Brit Global Specialty Insurers, one of the UK's leading insurers, and responsible for cyber and global technology portfolio within Brit itself. So welcome, Adele, and here to answer many questions, hopefully around cyber insurance. And last but very much not least, joining us from Glaziers Hall in London, who are very kindly facilitating and hosting this webinar on our behalf, is Mark Saville, who is the founder of Data Vault, a data storage and backup specialist, and someone who is a good friend to the Police Digital Security Centre as well. So welcome everyone. Today's process, obviously, we're going to do this very much like a panel interview where there's a couple of questions that I want to be asking Jason, Adele, Stuart and Mark, and then very much keen to get your questions and comments as well. Obviously, we'll try and pick some of those up in the chat. But at the end, if there's anyone or any questions that I haven't managed to hoover up, then of course I'll try and highlight those as well. So first question I'd really like to ask Jason, first up in the morning, just really interested to get your sort of perspective on what you're seeing at the moment in terms of ransomware. In the UK, clearly we're seeing it as a growing problem. Some really interesting statistics coming out of UK government now on how much of a threat it is, but I very much welcome your steer on what you're seeing.
Sure. And I'll give you a reference more from North America. I've done some work with UK clients, unfortunately. But what we're seeing is most industries with sensitive information are targets, things like legal and accounting, manufacturing, a number of ancillary businesses around hospital services, unfortunately. And anywhere where they, threat actors feel that they can encrypt, have anxiety, have an immediacy to try and get the businesses back up and running, and extort not only with the encryption of the data, but they are exfiltrating, meaning they're taking and stealing data out of those environments. And the higher the sensitivity of the data, the more concerned the target or the victim in this situation is going to be concerned about it and want to negotiate with them. In terms of average amounts, again, it's small, medium enterprises. We work with small proprietors all the way up to billion-dollar corporations. They're roughly pricing things, on a scale of 1% or up to 5% of gross revenues. That's numbers that they find online. They may not even be right, or information that they've taken from the target's environment. They've seen the financials, they've seen the bank accounts. We're seeing roughly $225,000 US on average, but some negotiated amounts can be in the millions, because the top amounts that we've dealt with directly for clients could be in the tens of millions up to $50 million. You've seen the news, that's true. We're seeing the data extortion. It's a double extortion now. Not only are they encrypting, but they're stealing information. That's occurring more than 80% of the time. So you can imagine they've been in your system already. They've taken significant gigabytes, even up to terabytes, and then they're going to hold that ransom as well. And we see them being very aggressive. So they want very short timelines. They want to be entertained. They want to negotiate. They want you to come to the dark web in the chat rooms, engage with them within 2 or 3 days, sometimes even less. And to get your attention, if you're not willing to entertain them, they are going to email you the company, the company's executives, the shareholders, stakeholders. They'll call, they're texting, they are faxing, they are pretending to be the consulate of Brazil in a case that we just had yesterday to get you to answer the phone, and they're doing denial of service attacks on your website. Anything they can do, they're doing now, and they're weaponizing your information against you to get you to the negotiation table. So
Wow.
generally, those are the stats.
There's some really interesting figures. I mean, that figure of $225,000 on average is a pretty steep figure, and of course, as you said, goes up high. So, to tell me, Jason, how do you get involved? I mean, ransomware negotiation. Talk us through what is that. I mean, it sounds really exciting and fascinating, but tell us the process.
Sure. So first of all, we're part of the much larger incident response team. We work very, very closely with breach counsel. Myself, I'm a recovering lawyer, so I understand the process and the concerns around confidentiality and privacy and disclosure of stolen information. We work very closely with the insurers, the carriers, the client, obviously, and with forensic computing companies and their IT staff or IT managed service providers to understand the incident. We'll get brought in to do an initial threat intelligence. So if it's a ransomware variant, a group that we've dealt with, we know their tactics, we know their propensity to deliver on their promises, we know how aggressive they negotiate, we know their follow through on the deal assurances or lack of follow through. And we can provide some intelligence at the beginning to help with the crisis management, to help with the strategy, and to help put the team around what has to be done. We'll, if we're engaged, initially just start with an investigation. There's no requirement to pay, there's no requirement to engage them, but it's always a good idea to find out what they may have taken from an evidentiary point of view. Going into the chat room and saying, hey, you hit us, what did you take? What proof can you provide to us? What sample files, what file trees? That information is then fed back to counsel, through counsel, of course, to the forensics, and they can see where they've been in networks, how deep they've been in certain networks, and how they may have moved laterally across networks, and what information they would have had access to. Typically, you're going to see things like they've been in finance, they've been in HR, they've gone after payroll, they've gone after confidentiality agreements, IP, and very data intensive, design intensive industries. You know about some of the big cases, especially a Canadian company recently that was in aerospace. So they know exactly what they're looking for. They don't care too much for anything that's not going to get your attention. And they'll just take the reams of data down. If they're very good analysts, they'll take enough to make you concerned. So we start providing that information back to develop a communication strategy as well as a negotiation strategy. We are last resort. I don't recommend anyone pay. I recommend always that law enforcement is advised of the situation, and that clients understand that there is always risk. We are dealing with criminals. At any point in time, they could not deliver. They could publish on their publishing site. They call it a leak site or a blog or a news site. They think they're doing the world a favor with transparency to show you how companies are protected, but the reality is they're just using for extorting. And we're monitoring the dark web as well so that clients understand if and when they may publish the name of the company to shame them, or some data to get your attention, or they'll just, if they don't get a deal, publish the whole lot. So we're in there developing the strategy. If the company can recover, which is a positive sign, they don't need the decryptors, that's amazing. We're not negotiating for decryptors, but we are concerned if there's the publication aspect of it, and we need to try and suppress that. Part of our strategy will be with what are the victims in the building we need to get out. And up until the end, there's still no requirement to pay anyone, but it may be useful and worthwhile to get more information or delay while the recovery process is going on, to give the forensic team some time and give everybody time through counsel to develop their communication strategy, their disclosure strategy. If a payment is the ultimate last resort, we have the ability to facilitate. You can imagine that the criminals don't want a bag full of cash in the back alley. They want cryptocurrencies. They want digital. Some of them are Bitcoin. Most of them are Bitcoin, but some of them are also altcoins like Monero and things that are non-traceable on the blockchain. And so that allows them to move monies around the world and then off-ramp in fiat somewhere else. If we're doing a settlement, we do a lot of compliance. So we have to search the OFAC sanctions list. So anyone who's a designated individual or designated entity on the US Treasury's list, we'll search, but we'll also search all the special interests through the UK, through Canada, globally. We have access to that. You can imagine that attribution is quite hard. You're dealing with a Tor site, you're dealing with a chat room. They're not saying, hi, welcome, you know, we're calling you from Crimea this morning and the Russian government is supporting us. We appreciate that threat actors are coming from different places in the world, and we appreciate that they are ultimately trying to negotiate and get a payment and satisfy a basic business principle that they will provide decryptors, they'll tell you they're deleting the data, there's always a question whether or not it's been fully suppressed, and they'll help you with some tech support, and they'll stop, you know, attacking the company if they're in a full-blown attack, or they're still in your network, they will stand down. So, you know, we can get the sense, we can provide the advice, we can get the comfort, we can share this information with the team when they in real time are making decisions, and ultimately, if we make a payment, we will do that through a cryptocurrency and work out some deal terms. In all of our cases, 100% of them, we have received decryptors. We've received in 100% of the cases promises and proof of data deletion. I always question whether or not copies were made, and in some situations we have seen duplicate copies in other places. It's very, very hard to assess if one threat actor or a group of threat actors that was involved in the malware attack on the network that took the data, and another one on a ransom as a service platform that's negotiating as the agents. There's questions whether or not data has moved between those parties, or if all the affiliates or criminals have actually deleted the data. So hopefully we've gotten what we've been asked for. We provide that data back. We provide the transcripts to counsel and to the FBI or law enforcement, and that's evidence of the crime. And then we help with closing the matter and making sure that we receive the technical support and that they delete the chat room and they never publish again, as much as we can get assurances in the situation.
Brilliant. That's really helpful, Jason. I want to bring Stuart in a moment, but there's two very quick questions I just wanted to ask you. First of all, Jason, first question is, and I'll ask them both together, is there a typical cyber criminal that's committing these acts of ransomware? Are you able to say this is what, you know, we're typically seeing in terms of the either the location of the cyber criminal or the type of individual or group that's carrying that out? And the second question is, you know, how successful can you be in helping these organizations? You know, is it easy? I mean, clearly it's not, but, you know, what are the chances of success if an organization finds itself in that situation where it is being held to ransom?
Okay, I'll try and answer the first question. It's not always known if we're dealing with the same groups. There are commonalities in syntax and grammar and the way they purport. The business infrastructure, the websites, you know, they're all sharing from each other's playbooks, so it's difficult. They're all extorting now and stealing data. There are similarities, but there's a number of groups, criminal groups, that from all over the world are using similar tactics, and they may be using agents in different countries. So it is very hard, and you know, this is probably a much longer discussion as to where everyone's coming from, but you know, we hope that they're not terrorist groups, and we hope they're not terrorist sanctioned or countries, and we can't deal with those obviously from a compliance point. We would never pay. So that's on the first part. We try and do as much assessment as we can with very little information. They don't give us their address. Okay.
Okay.
Although one did, we had to send a wire once, and that's a longer story. Why they would do that, I don't know. And then this is, what was it? The second question
was about success, chances of
success. So we go into it from the approach on first principles, always that we're dealing with a new group we've never dealt with before, and we try and assess and get a confidence throughout. I've got a group right now that's not acting and not behaving and continuing to go outside the formal communication channel, and they're continuing to call the IT director and asking him to negotiate, and they're not giving us a comfort that they're going to play fairly and try and get to a deal and create goodwill. I wouldn't say we're negotiating good faith, but we have to have some comfort that the other party is going to deliver. In most cases, we have that comfort, and we test that along the way with the way everyone's negotiating, the style of negotiation, whether or not they're being fair in that sense. And then if they're confirming the deal points, like that they are going to give us what we've asked for, and they're going to promise not to do it again. And then ultimately, it's the management of the situation and the maturity of the management team if they've done an incident response plan already, or they know the state of their data and they know the state of their recovery, they're going to be able to get up the decision curve very quickly to understand what to do. And so it's very much a collaborative effort. We can't negotiate in a vacuum. We have to know what we're working towards. So that makes it a lot easier if companies are already prepared and backed up and safe and proactive, and then know how to handle and whether they can make a decision to negotiate for whatever, to actually make a settlement, or just to buy some time, or we're not going to negotiate with these guys at all. That's our ethical and moral position, and that's fine.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jason. Stuart,
Yeah.
I'm keen to bring you in, and I guess Jason mentioned there about the advice that he gives, and indeed something that the UK government says is very much around don't pay ransoms. And I just perhaps be interested in finding out what's the legal position and the legal implications around ransoms. So when an organisation's faced with a situation, what do they need to consider from a legal perspective?
Golly, so many questions in that. The basic point is that we're not yet facing a legislative environment where the payment of ransoms has been prohibited. So what you're really dealing with is related legal frameworks about dealing with criminals and bad actors. So the real issue here is whether an organisation is operating when they're on a sanction list, official sanction list, and Jason's mentioned, AFAC. And if you are on a sanctions list, a US government sanction list being probably the most important one to understand, then dealing with those sanctions entities is an exceptionally serious criminal offence. We're talking about jail time for a long time. So you've got to make sure that you've got that covered off. But aside from that, that you are able to pay, at least in the context of a legislative framework. I mean, from there you start to drop down, the tree of law, if you like, a bit of a metaphor, isn't it? Into other spaces. So, for instance, what's the regulatory environment saying? In those situations, it isn't really about a prohibition of paying a ransom that is not rendered unlawful in the way I've just described. What you're really concerned with is as a controls question. What does the overall incident mean? So, in that sense, if you're dealing with a regulator, it isn't the payment of a ransom that's a legal problem. It's the fact you're in the situation in the first place, which becomes a problem. Cascading, moving a bit further down, you then get outside of the regulatory systems, you get into a private law obligation, so essentially contractual positions. The deal that you have, a relationship you have with a third party, may contain ransomware payment prohibitions. I've not seen any contracts that effect. I can understand that that those are going to be drafting questions that would go through the lawyer's mind. And I've said it because it's something I've been thinking about how do I deal in a contractual situation with these kind of threats? Because there's the undertow issue of if client A or entity A gets into this situation, it's not simply entity A's data that's at risk. It's other people's data, other organisations' data. So their customers' supply chain issues. But that's really the shape of the the legal landscape, and I think that there doesn't yet seem to be a real momentum to change that. So I'll give an example from current the current UK experience. So the former head of the NCSC, National Cybersecurity Centre, was on record a couple of weeks ago. Well, it wasn't that long ago, certainly in April, I think. Saying that we need to be looking at the legislative prohibition of ransom payments. But on the other hand, he commented that can understand why organisations would pay when they're in the position they're in. So there you go. There's a recognition that we're not quite yet there in terms of a public policy question. I mean, another way of looking at it is the government's white paper on the online harms bill. was published just before Christmas. And, you know, there's a variety of, you know, issues of online harm, which, you know, ransomware is part of and supports. And there's no suggestion inside that framework that we're going to go down a, you know, a legislative prohibition path. So I hope that helps, Simon. I hope that gives you a few ideas.
I think it's really interesting. I was just going to ask, you know, when you're engaging with the customers that you work with through DWF, and what's their sort of appetite? Do they think, is there an expectation that there's going to be legislation coming down the line in the next few years? Is that what they're preparing for, or are they still thinking that they should be allowed to have that choice of whether they pay or not?
Yeah, you know, I'm not, you know, that's not really part of the conversation at all. You know, if you're in my position and you're instructed on a ransom conversation, you're not talking about, you know, philosophical questions of future law reform. You know, really, you know, the very first thing you're trying to understand is, you know, what's the time frame that I'm working within? As Jason mentioned, there's a ticking clock. So we've got that bit. And then the other other side of it is, let's assume that all goes pear-shaped. You know, what have I got? You know, what's my actual resilience like? You know, that's the second part of the dynamic. You know, how I've got backups. Mark will talk about that, for instance. You see, you've got those two dynamics. Then the next dynamic is, who do I tell? You know, so you've got obviously the insurer dynamic, which Adele will speak to. You know, I need to tell my insurers, right? You know, through to the regulatory duties of notification. The basic point about a ransom attack, whether it does or does not involve exfiltration. Obviously, exfiltration is now, you know, they're joined as issues. But whether or not it's exfiltration, there is a look into a network, and that is a prohibited act, for instance, under data protection legislation. You know, and you know, it's a prohibited act under financial services, you know, rules. The point I'm trying to make is that, you know, if you are victim to ransomware, you are actually already operating in a framework of notification obligations. So you're trying to work out whom should you tell. And the other bit, the fourth bit that you're looking at, is whom do you bring in? You know, where's the support structures? You know, where's my Jason? You know, where's my Adele? Where's my Mark? You know, who are these people? Where do I get them from? You know, how am I going to spin up the team, you know, at an appropriate pace? So after the event, you know, there is always that sort of, if you come out of it and you had to pay a ransom and you achieved all the objectives that Jason has mentioned in terms of, you know, the settlement, if you like, you know, confidentiality, decryptors, evidence of delete, and all that stuff. You know, if you achieve all of that, when you come out of it, that's when the philosophical question starts to mature, because the basic point here is that until there is a global idea around all of this, there will always be a safe harbor for the criminals, you see. In the presence of a safe harbor, you know, legislative prohibitions on you know, paying ransoms are not, you know, ultimately going to be successful, in my view, because it's still coming in. It's still coming in. It's still coming in. So those are my perspectives.
Brilliant. That's really helpful. Thank you, Stuart. And you mentioned Adele and the role of insurance, and I guess, Adele, you know, the bottom line of this is insurers, you know, arguably foot the bill for the likes of Jason and Stuart in terms of helping those business and those customers of yours out. Just really interested, Adele, what is the role of insurers around cyber? What's your role, and how do you support businesses in terms of addressing some of these challenges?
Yeah, so I mean, we do get the benefit of footing the bill when things go wrong, but actually cyber insurance is very different to other lines of insurance. So there's a greater reliance, particularly within the SME sector, on insurers to provide the incident response. So basically, as part of the insurance package, it's one phone number, and after that number is rung, your breach coach, so your lawyer, will get involved. They will actually maintain privilege. So anything that's discovered will actually be protected by privilege between yourselves and your lawyer. And they will then, to use the American phrase, quarterback the entire incident. So they'll project manage it. They'll bring in the IT forensics people. They'll bring in the forensic accountants and everything else to try and deal with the situation. They will help with notifying regulators and notifying affected individuals if there's a data breach. And just basically getting you back up and running and on your feet. And then And all of that is actually a service that's provided under your insurance policy. The other aspect to cyber insurance, which is very different to other lines of insurance, is the fact that you actually get pre-breach services, which are designed to actually try and prevent such an incident happening. Because whilst we're there to help pick up the pieces, so to speak, if the worst happens, we actually don't really want to see our insureds and our clients in that situation. So, for example, we offer all of our clients a virtual CISO service. So that's it's two main aspects. One is an online portal that has in excess of 500 different compliance and best practice materials that are available, that we subsidize, we've paid for it, and we then pass that benefit on to our insureds. You can go in and download, for example, training material to, train your employees, get your employees aware of, how ransomware is working, or, phishing, any sort of phone, social engineering type frauds as well, because humans are humans and humans make mistakes. But if they're trained and alert to it, it actually helps prevent the situation from occurring. And in addition to that, there's also something called the virtual CISO service. So ultimately, if you just wanted to pick up the phone and have a quick chat, generally about what to do, that's also available, because ultimately we want to make sure that people aren't impacted as far as possible. I mean, we have seen some anecdotal evidence as well that clients or companies who do pay ransoms are more likely to be impacted again, and they're more likely to fall victim again. And ironically, actually, I think there's a lot of there's a degree of mentality that, oh, it's really only the big companies that are being targeted with these ransoms. It's the Facebook supply chain, et cetera. Well, based on the information that we've seen, actually, that probably 1 billion plus companies make up maybe about 10% of the actual claims activity we're seeing, because a lot of the smaller companies don't have the budgets, they don't have the expertise in-house to actually be, as secure. And so they're almost like low-hanging fruit, I suppose. We really just want to work with our experts and our clients in order to try and get everyone as secure and prepared as possible.
Fantastic. I mean, it's interesting you talk about some of the trends there, and I think we've discussed in the past about the relatively low take-up of cyber insurance in the UK, which I think is well below 10% and probably 4 times lower than perhaps what it is in the US. What are the reasons? I mean, the idea of that virtual CISO functioning sounds great, and the pre-breach work that you do, and of course during the breach and post-incident as well, is a really good value service. But why isn't there a greater uptake of cyber insurance, particularly perhaps among the SME community?
Well, it's an interesting one, because I think actually the reason why we've seen the take-up really increase in the US is because they have been aware of cyber, but more from a data breach perspective for a number of years. So I think actually from memory, it was California in 2003 that they first introduced the mandatory notification of individuals for when their data had been impacted. And so actually they've had a little bit of a head start on this front. So ransomware is now the flavor of the month. I'm sure that in a few months' time, the bad guys will think of something else to do to sort of make money. But actually, it did initially start as a data breach coverage. And so we're seeing more and more people actually becoming aware of it. Equally, they tend to try and buy insurance after they've already had an issue, because prior to that, if you're an SME business, or you've got limited budgets, for example, for your risk transfer or other activities, you've never previously purchased cyber insurance, you've never needed it before, why would you need it now? A lot of the we do sometimes get anecdotal evidence that people who work within the IT departments get slightly offended as well, that you're questioning whether or not they're actually doing a good job. The response I would generally say to that is, you don't buy car insurance because you're a terrible driver, you buy car insurance because stuff happens. It's the same principle with cyber insurance.
Fantastic, thank you. And Dale, perhaps moving on to Mark now, but Mark, Dale mentioned a really good point there about, you know, prevention. And I think it's a point that's made by some of the other panelists as well. You know, obviously, none of us want those organizations to have to go through having a ransomware attack and have to deal with what I imagine must be an extremely stressful situation to try and resolve. From a prevention perspective, and you know, we talk about data backup, what should organizations be doing? What are the things that you would say and you advise to those SME organizations out there?
Hey, thanks, Simon. So I mean, I think it's interesting that you know, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation if companies could simply switch over to last night's backup and restore the data, and everything's back up and running, and the company just loses a day's worth of work and they're back up and running, right? They find out what caused the problem, they stop that from happening again, and we're kind of in good shape. But over the last 4 or 5 years, this sort of whole area has just been evolving at a really fast pace. I mean, the ransomware that's in the market today is completely different that we see in networks, attacking networks. As Jason mentioned, you know, the copying out, exfiltration of data, especially if you're then not able to recover the data yourself, so they leave an encrypted copy on your infrastructure or in the cloud, so you can't actually determine what it was that they stole. You hope that you know what's in there, but you really can't be 100% certain because you haven't been able to recover it. And I think to a large extent, the technology companies in this market are way behind the way that this ransomware is developed. I think if you're not in a position to be able to scan the data, check that it's clean, detect any malware that's in there. We're seeing malware in virtually every kind of data source in the Windows market at the moment, and that kind of malware can sit in data for 6 months without the users knowing about it. So it's in the backups for that period of time. And I just think we're way out of touch. I think the technologies that people are using and the techniques they're using, they're just not good enough to detect this until it happens. And by that point, you've lost the backups, you've lost the data. So it's a big problem. We created a really simple little 5-question check sheet that organizations can challenge their IT providers over and their IT backup suppliers over, because I think if those 5 things are not being done, they stand a very low chance of getting their data back in the event of a ransomware attack. So I think there needs to be a bit more maturity and a bit more honesty from backup providers about what they should be doing. Yeah. Good.
Thank you. Just wanted to perhaps ask you a question again, Mark, and then perhaps throw this open to some of the others on the panel. And it's around, you know, how do you change behaviour? How do you change people's behaviour? Because we know we struggle, government policing, in getting a sustainable change in the way that businesses look at cyber threat and risk. It's a constant challenge to try and do that. What things do you think will help businesses start embracing this in a much more proactive way?
I think better awareness. I mean, we've been tracking ransomware headlines since Travelex in January 2020. We're now ticket taping across our website about 48 ransomware headlines. So they're not general data breaches or, you know, other types of incident. And these are ones that are appearing in the IT press, in the cybersecurity press. But it's only occasionally that you get a mainstream article, and it's across many sectors. I mean, it's manufacturing, production, retail, financial services, business and professional services. The IT industry is getting hammered. Everybody's heard of SolarWinds, but there's lots of other incidents. Education, universities, schools, the public sector, government departments. But I just think there needs to be a broader awareness, for sure. And unfortunately, we still seem to be suffering from it won't happen to me. So we see huge action post breach. I think Adele mentioned it. I would say in about 70% of cases, our services to ensure recoverability and detection get installed after invoice fraud or exfiltration of data, where the client's now concerned that ransomware might be on their network, but they can't detect it. So there's a real problem. There's a huge amount of activity post breach, and I'm sure Jason, Stuart and Adele can talk to the cost, but I'm led to believe it costs about 4 or 5 times more to remediate after the event than it would have done to put the right precautions and processes and insurance cover and teams together in a proper plan. So, you know, it actually makes economic sense to plan properly.
Fantastic, thank you, Mark. And I'll ask the same question to Jason in a second, but I just noticed Ben's popped a little point in the chat, which I think is really valid. And it says there, as an MSP, our biggest obstacle when offering anything around cybersecurity and ransomware, etc., is budget. They also have that "it won't happen to me" attitude. How much of these products and solutions could they put on finance? And I think that's a really broad point that you know, I'm sure others will recognise. Jason, same question to you around, you know, prevention. How can these organisations reduce their vulnerability in the first place? And I'm really interested, you know, in your observations from the clients that you're working with. But because you work globally, are there things that you see internationally which you think here in the UK would be really beneficial for us to follow as well?
Sure. Again, being proactive, all the comments that Adele and Mark made, going through and doing a incident response plan, doing an audit of the vulnerabilities, the data that you may have, knowing where information is, and having a policy of least access, least permissions. So only those who should have access should have access. We see time and time again, somebody in some group wasn't permissioned properly and they get phished. Those credentials are used to go across a network. Taking information off networks that shouldn't be there. There's always a no man's land where a share file zone, people just throw stuff in and they don't even know what they had there, and it really ends up being quite sensitive. So audit, clean up, good housekeeping. To Mark's point, backup. Phishing your employees to train them. I ran a private equity fund. It was worth $2 billion in assets under management, and I ran the IT department, and that's what kept me up at night. We saw ourselves as a target. We had to go to management and get budget. It was hundreds of thousands of dollars that we needed to rebuild our on-prem system, to put proper two-factor authentication in, endpoint solutions, and then run it through and run the fire drills, do the tabletop exercises so people know what could happen. Have someone like me tell them what the worst case scenario is. Nobody wants to be on the receiving end of "you've just been hacked, we have your data." It's enough stress already on the IT departments and execs, and especially with this pandemic, for everyone to be remotely working. A lot more thought should have gone into what happens if, in the following situations, we are distributed and no longer protected under our corporate Wi-Fi or corporate environments. And so that's where a business continuity plan, incident response plan comes into place, and then knowing who to call and move quickly. The companies that are the most mature, that are most prepared, stuff's going to happen. You can't 100% stop. You're going to have insurance, you're going to have training and planning, but then you're going to, in a crisis, know how to act and be proactive to make quick decisions. And it's the companies that don't have that and don't have good advisors around them and deny that there's been a situation that it gets to the point where published information may already be out there and they're trying to, you know, win something back that's already been let go. It's too late by then. So having this discussion every few months, looking at what the latest trends are. I don't say you have to be bleeding edge, but you just have to be better than than the worst guys. You don't want to be an easy target. You don't want ports to be open. Patch your stuff. Train people that when your system says you should update your Windows, you should update the Windows and reset the computer. There's some basic things. And the threat actors take advantage of that. So I guess my parting thoughts on that is, if it keeps you up at night, that's good. Then go do something about it. Don't put it off.
Thank you, Jason. And just before asking the same question to Stuart and then Adele, one thing that sort of strikes me on Ben's comment there, that last sentence in particular, is about, you know, seeing cybersecurity as a cost as opposed to an investment. And I guess, you know, Jason, how do you sort of overcome that? Is there a way, you used your example there of working, you know, running a sort of the IT department there. How do you get decision makers, senior decision makers within and boardrooms within those organizations to start seeing it as an investment to help protect their businesses as opposed to, oh, it's another cost?
Have them attend forums like this. Have them talk to advisors that they should never, ever want to have to call. Have them put together in their incident response plan the hotline of people with Stuart's number at the top saying, God forbid something should happen, this is what's, you're going to have to talk to. Share some of the stories in the market, talk to the insurers. There's a lot of advisory. You have to be open to it and you have to be concerned about it. And then you've got to go spend some money. So do a cost benefit analysis. What would it take to just patch our systems? Have oversight from another managed service provider, look at it every month. What are the checks and balances in your system? There's good hygiene and there's good housekeeping, and it's all out there. And I think companies just get very busy with what they do, and they have to think about this as reinforcing. I teach you how to run my business, how to market my product, the same way I teach you how to protect my assets and to protect my intellectual property.
Brilliant, thank you. And Stuart, again, focusing on prevention, what's your sort of view on what can organisations do or should they be doing to try and reduce their vulnerability?
It's such a great question. I want to come at it a different way. Because Jason's absolutely right in terms of the elements on a to-do list, and Mark and Adele, they're absolutely spot on. So for me, I think the question, the philosophical question is, where does the controlling mind of the business get its confidence from, or the controlling mind of the organization? How do we achieve and improve confidence levels inside the business about the outcomes that we're seeking to achieve? Because for me, when I look at these matters, I look at this in the context of what my entire career has been about, which is ultimately root cause analysis. So the first 10 years of my career, I spent it in court wearing a wig, as a barrister. And then for the past 20 odd years, I've operated as a solicitor, because 20 years ago, there were no solicitors doing the work. So in those days, you had to go through a solicitor to see a barrister. So my entire makeup is about root cause analysis, but you describe that as litigation, or you describe it as, evidence in a legal sense. And the thing that most strikes me about root cause is that the organization did not have a mechanism to judge its confidence levels. It didn't really understand what that means in a philosophical sense, and how would we go about measuring it. So I'll give a specific example of what I'm trying to talk about. So if you think about audit as a mechanism of confidence, it's an assurance mechanism. Assurance and confidence, are synonyms. But assurance is essentially looking at the presence or absence of structures and artifacts and how they're performing. So the structure is a person, a CISO, or a structure is a steering committee, and an artifact is a policy or a procedure, or something like that. The dialogue that I've really seen happening in business has been about the presence or absence of structures and artifacts, rather than how do we get confidence that they are delivering the outcomes we're seeking to achieve. So, here's an example. So imagine an interaction between a CEO and a CISO on this topic. And it might be, have we got a policy, there's an artifact in place to deal with ransomware? And that becomes a very binary question. It's yes or no, we do not. The answer loads you to yes, because if it's a no, why you're in the room. Okay, so that's a dialogue that focuses on the presence of artifacts. But if you changed it slightly, you can still encompass the artifact question. You can still go into the same zone, but you can actually get to a different level of analysis. So change it around. How confident are we that our policy on ransomware is delivering the outcomes we're seeking to achieve? That is no longer a binary question, albeit it homes in on exactly the same place. And it puts the artifact inside a context. And that to me is really what this is about, is that if we take all of the ingredients on Jason, Mark's and Adele's list, the question we need to address is, where do we get our confidence from that those things in their presence are going to deliver the outcomes that we seek to achieve? And that to me, what we're talking about really in an assurance sense is we're talking about sentiment analysis being potentially a missing part of the picture, not simply a controls analysis. So There you go. Same issue, but answered from a different way, Simon.
Thank you very much, Stuart. No, really, really useful insight there as well. And Adele, again, just welcome from an insurance perspective. You've talked about some of the pre-breach work that you're doing and other insurers are doing, but what do you want to see more of, and how can we change that behaviour to be more sustainable?
Well, I mean, ultimately, we do want to see proactivity, and as Jason actually alluded to earlier on, he said that it's around 5% of revenue is being demanded as a ransom, and someone else mentioned, I think it was actually Jason as well, that people are viewing all the preparation stuff as a cost rather than an investment. Ultimately, if you're doing a big IT project to introduce like MFA and bring yourself up to best or as good a standard as you can do, that's something that you can stagger over a period of time. Again, if you have to find 5% of your revenue in one go, that's probably not going to be quite as easy to do. So if you're looking at it purely from a brass tacks perspective, that would be one way of looking at it. And from an insurance perspective, ultimately, it's a risk transfer mechanism that you can purchase relatively cheaply that would cover all of these costs and help you prepare. And equally, ultimately, when you're in the midst of an encryption event, you know who to call to get all of these experts, rather than opening up the digital yellow pages to try and find someone who's going to be doing the IT forensics work for you, for example, and then in the heat of the moment wasting time negotiating terms with someone that you may or may not know whether they're any good or not. So yeah,
I think that's a really good point, isn't it? If you and I speak to quite a few victims of cybercrime, and the first question is where do they get that help from? And if you're right, if you're left to try and Google a provider, it's very hard to tell the difference between someone who is good and actually understands how your business operates to someone out there who's perhaps less credible, and that's an additional stress. And of course, the clock's always ticking in these things, which makes it more difficult. We've got about 5 minutes left of the webinar, and we've got a question from Mark on the chat box, Mark with a C. So he says, Mark Saville mentioned briefly evolving ransomware. Given these things are now deleting backups, how can they help organizations really protect themselves and their data? And I think, Mark, perhaps we ask you that question first.
So you need to keep backups away from the main infrastructure. I mean, there's a basic principle in IT that you don't keep backups in the same infrastructure or on the same technology. I think this also becomes quite key when you look at things like cloud data, because cloud, most of the cloud applications that people use today, that they don't have a backup anyway, right? And people, when they do build backups sometimes for them, put that data back into the same cloud. And I use as an illustration there Microsoft 365, which is just exploded. The adoption of that has exploded in the last 12 months. I mean, we see some people putting backups for 365 data in Azure, which is the Microsoft cloud that 365 sits in, right? So if heaven forbid, Azure in some way got compromised, not only would you lose your SaaS applications, email, OneDrive, SharePoint and the like, Teams, but you'd also actually stand a good chance of losing the backup data. So there needs to be complete separation. It's not just as simple as saying cloud. It's a case of saying, well, where is the data that we're using and where should the backups be held? So that, I think that's one key element. I think multi-factor authentication is the other one. I mean, you have to protect those backups so they're not deleted. But I actually see the bigger issue at the moment is the infection of data, the long-term infection of data. But it's I mean it's one of the 3 tenets of good practice around how you can recover that data back. And hiding the backup file names is the other one.
Good. Yeah. Thank you, Mark. I just wonder if Jason or Stuart or Adele wanted to come in on that at all.
No, it's good.
No, that's good.
Okay, well, thank you, Mark, for that one. David's just popped up with a question in the chat box as well, and I think this one is for Stuart. which is, as I understand it, is it against the law to pay a ransom demand in the USA? Do you think this will become law in the UK? I think we sort of briefly touched on this earlier, but again, if you just give a very short answer, Stuart, that'd be really helpful.
So, just again, recapping on where we started, no, that there isn't, a legislation in the United States that prohibits the payment of ransoms in the context we're talking about, unless the entity is on a financial sanctions list that the US government has added them to. So that's the check and balance that you need to look to. And by the way, you have to look at that even if you're not in the United States, just to make it sure. So if let's say it's a British company only physically here and only dealing with businesses in customers in this country, you still have to check that US stuff.
Fabulous. Thanks, Stuart. Okay, so I think we've just got a couple of minutes left. If anyone wants to ask a question, please pop it in the chat box and we'll deal with it. But perhaps we just go round with the panelists, and I just perhaps want one takeaway from you each to share with those attending the webinar today. If there's one piece of advice or information that you would like to share, then please go ahead. So, Jason, can I start with you, perhaps as our first panelist? Your nugget of information.
Sure. So be as proactive as you can, ask the questions, do the audits, do the penetration tests, and do training. So hopefully you never have to call me. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Adele.
I mean, very, very similar to Jason. Just, be prepared. Think of it, actually sit down, think about what the impact would be and how you would try and prevent it, and also how you'd go about recovering from it as well.
Thank you, Adele. Mark.
If you're a user of Office 365 or you're a reseller of Office 365, make sure every single customer's backed up. Make sure every single piece of that data, if possible, you're scanning as part of the backup. That's where we see all of this activity happening at the moment.
Thank you, Mark. And last but not least, Stuart.
Okay, this will give us sort of context. So if you were to do a breach notification letter to the Information Commissioner about a cybersecurity event, you might get a response in 4 weeks. If you do a breach notification letter about a ransom issue, you'll get a response in a week. The basic point is we're now in a system now where the regulatory landscape perceives this to be something that needs to be dealt with fast.
Brilliant. Thank you. And thank you, everyone. Just want to draw to a close to this webinar. And thank you, everyone, for attending. I think it's been really useful. Some fabulous insights from Jason, Stuart, Mark, and Adele in terms of ransomware, the scale of the problem, and how they work in the environment to keep those organizations safe. I think, Stuart, you've made an offer there in the chat. If I'm guessing your 15418 is your username.
That's me.
And I guess, is it easiest to contact you? We will have contact details on the that we'll send out after the to the webinar. I think we'll do so we've got a recording of it as well. But you very kindly offered to show people or walk people through a model for confidence analysis, which I'm sure would be of great interest to many people on this webinar. So thank you, everyone, for attending today. As I said, I think it's been really useful, and also thanks for Nick and the team at Glaziers Hall, who very kindly put on the technology for us today to be able to host this. Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful day and a wonderful rest of the week. Look forward to seeing you soon.
And thank you, Simon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.